After sleepless nights, the day that he had been waiting for finally came again. Keith held the piece of envelope in his hand and carefully took out the letter. As he read the letter, his face lit and glowed like it always does when he received news on his promotion. Many of his colleagues forcefully gave insincere smiles and congratulated Keith. Only Dave, his work buddy, seemed to be genuinely happy for him. Keith's colleagues felt that it was strange that Keith was getting promoted every year, seeing how the most excellent staffs were promoted only every 3 years. What made things even more strange was that Keith was your average worker, far from a workaholic, and wasn't the type that was exactly a quick learner. In that past, with his less than excellent performance at work, Keith used to complain a lot about not getting promoted. Keith got so frustrated that it affected his morale at work. "It's so weird that he is getting promoted again," whispered Ken, who was one of Keith's colleagues. "Yeah, I know, right. And there's something even weirder. Did you know, before these past 4 years, that he was constantly getting promoted every year? He was promoted only once in 7 years," replied Bert, another one of Keith's colleagues. Amidst the congratulations that he was receiving, Ken suddenly voiced out in a sarcastic tone, "Hey Keith, it must be that silk wristlet that you've been wearing, huh? Works like a charm," referring to the reason Keith got promoted. The smile on Keith's face turned slightly sour, showing signs of someone who was offended by a comment but tried to keep his emotions intact. "Hey, it's all the hard work, man," replied Keith with a forced smile. From the response, Keith's colleagues knew that he took the comment to heart, and the room turned slightly awkward. To break the awkwardness of the room, Keith's buddy Dave suddenly said, "Okay, guys, I have another piece of news," as Dave smiled, seemingly excited to share the news with his colleagues. "What is it, man? Come on, tell us," asked Ken. "Well, I received an offer at another company, and next week will be my last in our beloved office," said Dave with a cheerful tone to his voice. "No way, that's great news for you, man. I'm happy for you. But it's quite sad that you're suddenly leaving," said Ken, this time with an honest tone. The reactions to Dave's news in the room weren't surprising, seeing how Dave was popular among his colleagues, unlike Keith, who wasn't exactly the most charismatic. The week after, Keith's last day in the office finally ended. "Boys, are you ready?" said Dave, referring to the plans they had later that night to celebrate both Keith's promotion and Dave's new job offer. Dave, Keith, Bert, and Ken gathered later that evening at a hotel to celebrate for the night. Bert and Ken were there only because it was also Dave's farewell gathering. If it was only for Keith, they wouldn't have gone. "Cheers, boys. This is to a new start for both me and Keith. A toast to us, and once again, congrats to my buddy Keith, who got promoted once again," said Dave. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it," replied Keith. The four of them, mainly Dave, Bert, and Ken, enjoyed themselves in the hotel that they booked for the night. They talked, laughed, and sang their hearts out with the portable karaoke set. With plenty of food left unfinished and some drinks partially spilled on the table, the four of them fell asleep while the karaoke music continued playing in the background. Bert fell asleep on the couch, and Ken slept while seated on the floor next to Bert. Dave fell asleep on one of the single beds while Keith fell asleep on the other. In the middle of the night, Dave suddenly woke up after feeling the urgent need to use the bathroom. But as his eyes opened, still with blurry vision, Dave saw a dark figure with what seemed like red clothing right beside Keith, staring right at his buddy. The figure stood there, barely swaying back and forth, before slowly moving a hand toward Keith's wrist. Dave's body froze at the sight of it, not knowing why he couldn't move or scream at that point of time. The figure's long, scrawny fingers with sharp fingernails then sliced open a wound on Keith's wrist, where his silk wristlet was worn on. Still lying still on the bed and feeling terrified, Dave saw the dark figure who seemed to have brought its head closer to Keith's wrist. The figure began licking blood that was coming out of Keith's wrist as the blood began to flow. Still frozen and completely horrified, all Dave could do was to forcefully close his partially opened eyes and tremble. As he was closing his eyes, seconds felt like hours as he just wanted to fall back asleep and wake up in the morning after the nightmare had ended. Suddenly, the licking sound stopped and Dave realized that the room became silent again, with only sounds of snores from Bert that could be heard. Dave slowly opened his eyes to take a peek at what had happened earlier and realized that the figure was no longer there. Dave partially sat up to have a closer look at Keith and noticed that there were no signs of bite on Keith's wrist, nor blood flowing from it, which was what he expected to see after what had happened earlier. Dave laid back down and turned sideways to face away from Keith, afraid that he might see the same incident again. Still thinking if what he saw was indeed true, Dave couldn't sleep for the next couple of hours, although he tried to. But eventually, Dave caved into his tiredness and fell asleep again. The next day, after the guys have all checked out of the hotel room that Saturday noon, Dave was driving back home alone in his car. He couldn't stop thinking of what had happened last night. Was it for real? It seemed way too real, though. But why were there no signs of the incident afterwards? There's no way I imagined it, said Dave to himself. As he was curious about what had happened, Dave thought about who he could talk to about this. Then, suddenly, Dave said to himself, "Oh yeah, Uncle Nick," after remembering how his uncle used to help family members when they were facing spiritual problems. Dave immediately made a detour and drove to his uncle's home instead. Once there, Dave knocked on Uncle Nick's door multiple times and called out, "Hey, Uncle Nick, are you home? Sorry to bother you, but I have something important to ask you." As Dave was still continuously knocking on the door, footsteps can be heard behind the door, and the door slowly opened. "Hey, Dave, what suddenly brings you here? Are you all right? You look tense," asked Uncle Nick. Dave went in and immediately shared what had happened the night before. Uncle Nick then asked Dave, "Do you have a photo of your friend?" Dave whipped out his smartphone, opened his photo gallery, and said, "Oh, sure, here's this guy right here." Uncle Nick took a long look at the photo and shook his head slightly. He then said, "Your friend took a very dangerous path, Dave." "What do you mean, Uncle Nick?" said Dave. "You see, what you saw last night at the hotel wasn't your imagination. What you saw last night happens every night to your friend. And that figure that you saw was your friend's dark angel," said Uncle Nick. "Wait, are you saying what I think you're saying, Uncle Nick?" said Dave as he began understanding what was going on. "It is, Dave. Your friend sold his soul to the devil so that he will continue to get a promotion every year. In return, he has to give the dark angel a little bit of his blood from his wrist. And that silk wristlet that he's wearing is the gateway for it to have access to your friend as much as it wants to," said Uncle Nick. "That's crazy. And is it gonna harm him?" asked Dave. "You see, Dave, every day that his blood is taken from him, a little bit of his soul goes along with it as well. And it will be only a matter of time before his soul will be fully taken from him. One day, he just won't wake up from his sleep anymore," said Uncle Nick. His curiosity is now turned to being severely worried for his friend that may lose his life. Dave said, There must be something that we can do for him, Uncle Nick. I can't just let him die like that, said Dave. You mustn't say anything to him, or anyone else, Dave. The Dark Angel may harm you if you try to get in the way. Not even I can do that. So, the only way that he can stay alive is to pass it on to someone else. Which means, if he decides to be free, he has to give his wristlet to someone else. And that someone else will have to eventually die in his place, said Uncle Nick. Dave sat there, for the first time silent, not knowing how else he can help his friend. What Uncle Nick said to Dave stayed in his mind for weeks to come as he thought about how he could help. But weeks grew into months as time went by and Dave grew busier at his new workplace. Dave began growing distant from Keith and the rest of his colleagues from his previous workplace. Dave and Keith no longer spent nights having fun together like they used to, and Dave's worry for Keith slowly faded to the back of his mind. Unknowingly, 3 years had gone by, and Dave finally got the news that he knew would be a matter of time. Dave received a text from Ken who shared the news that Keith had passed away in his sleep. Keith didn't have any medical issues, and the doctor said that he died of a heart attack during his sleep. But Dave knew that there was more to it than just a heart attack. He knew that Keith had sacrificed his life for an amazing career that he knew would eventually be short-lived.